Uh, Something that you mentioned, and again, people may not be aware of the size of the sums of just how much money was actually being moved abroad. Relatively late in your book, you mentioned one shipment of money. I believe it's from the Reichsbank or one of the corporate fronts that was set up by Axel Adolfsflügel Operation Eagle's Flight. And it was a sum that was sent to Brazil, I think, in March of 1945. And just that one shipment, one of many, many, many shipments around the world, was enormous by today's value. If you just detail that for us briefly.
Yes, I don't know which one precisely you're speaking of, but one comes to my mind immediately because the documentation has just came to worldwide attention about less than 10 years ago. And this was a shipment of 40 tons, that's tons, of gold from the Reichsbank. This 40 tons of gold was shipped through Portugal, the Bank of Portugal. It was underground, actually under the streets of Lisbon, and it was revealed, the paperwork was discovered, that of this gold, 40 tons of it was shipped from Portugal to Macau, which at that time, of course, was a Portuguese colony. That 40 tons of gold was then split into two shipments. One shipment of 20 tons went to China for some reason. It might have been to help prop up the Chiang Kai-shek movement, which is quite possible. And another 20 tons of gold went to Indonesia. We're not quite sure what that was all about, but I have my suspicions, which I talk about in the book. I believe that was part of what later became known as the Revolutionary Fund that was being controlled by then President Sukarno. That's only 40 tons of gold. That sounds like an enormous amount of gold. And it is, especially by today's standards. If you start to use roughly $1,000 an ounce and do the calculations, we're talking about a huge fortune. But that's only, as I say, a drop in the bucket. We're talking about, in terms of gold alone, we're talking about hundreds of tons of gold. Much of this either left Europe for Latin America, or it left Europe for Asia. In some cases, a lot of the so-called Black Eagle gold, which was gold that had been stamped with the Black Eagle of the Reichsbank, wound up in Asia. Some Black Eagle gold wound up in the Philippines, buried in caves there. The Japanese were also burying gold like crazy all throughout the Southeast Asia as their war was winding down, as they saw, again, the handwriting on the wall. They were burying the gold because they did not want to take it back to Japan, where it would be seized, of course, by the Allies. It was the same motivation for the Japanese as for the Nazis. And what we don't realize is that there was a certain degree of cooperation between the two governments, between the Third Reich and between the Japanese at the time. There was some technical cooperation. The Nazis were shipping their technology for building atomic weapons because they were in the middle of that technology. They were shipping that information plus blueprints and essential parts for the V-1 and V-2 rockets via submarine. They were shipping to Japan. It was interdicted towards the end of the war by the American forces. So there was a lot of cooperation and a lot of trade between the two countries. Japan had a lot of access to rubber in Southeast Asia and a lot of other essential raw materials for the war. And the Germans were shipping ball bearings and that sort of stuff that the Japanese needed to Japan. So there was trade going on between the countries. As the war was winding down, then this turned into a desperate attempt to hide as much money as possible overseas. So the Germans hid a lot of it in Latin America. They paid off Juan Perón when Perón became president in order to protect their interests in Argentina. Some money went to Bolivia, some went to Chile and Peru and Brazil, and some money actually went into Southeast Asia. And interestingly enough, some Japanese money wound up in South America as well. So they were moving money, hard currency, gold bars, artworks, sculptures, gold statues, and that sort of thing, all over the world. The locations of this were known only to a handful of people. Some people who buried the money and the gold overseas were then executed, like the old pirate days, so they couldn't reveal the location. So this is what was going on, and some of this money then became used later to prop up I would say pro-fascist or extreme right political parties in Japan, and of course back in Germany. We have another whole story taking place there as more and more Germans who had been Nazis found themselves incorporated into the West German government.